All right, in this segment we are going to talk about why English is so hard. And it has to do with where it came from. Where do you think English came from? It's got a very complicated and fascinating history. So it is objectively more difficult for East Asian students to learn English. There's no myth about that. In so many ways it is, first of all, complicated, and it is so very different from East Asian languages in so many ways linguistically. There's complexity in the vocabulary, and there's a rich history that has given English a very huge vocabulary, and it's really complicated in terms of the spelling patterns and the pronunciation. It's really complicated. Not only are there different spelling patterns, like different ways of spelling the same sound, and the same letter combinations can be pronounced different ways in different words. They're the stress patterns we saw in a previous video. Things like nation, national, nationality. All these kinds of complexities, different stress patterns, partly depends on where the words came from, and stress changes and vowel changes. It's awfully complicated. It's a very stressful language. It has a really complex stress system, or we maybe call it accent word stress system. It's probably more complicated than any language in the world in that regard. So where do you think English came from? It didn't exactly come from Latin. Where did it start? Do you know where it started? How it started? Well, let me give you a clue. I'm going to read a little bit of Old English, or Old English we sometimes call Anglo-Saxon, and I'll explain why that is. Maybe you've heard of Beowulf, especially in your literature classes. I'm going to read the beginning, the opening lines of Beowulf in the original Old English or Anglo-Saxon. So this is English from more than 1,000 years ago. 8th or 9th century is when it was written down. This is what English sounded like more than 1,000 years ago. What Wigerdena Geordagum, Theod Kuninga Frum Gefrunan, who the Athelingus Ellen Fremedon, Olskud Schulschefing Shadana Hriatum, Monigum Megthum, Meo Doset la Ofteach, Exolda Eurlos, Suden Erswerth, Feashaft Funden, Geethas vroeger wat werk zonder rognum, weer het mundem thach, oder he mij hoek sara zitendra, of gerade guran skolda. Rumban gulder. That was good kuning. I don't understand it. Except the last sentence means that was a good king. That was good kuning. Does that sound like English? No, probably doesn't to you. What does it sound like? What would you guess? Yes, a lot of you are guessing German. Sounds like German because it is basically German. It started as a variety of Old German or Germanic language. How? That's how English started. It started as a form of Old German. But how? How did you get an Old German language in England? All right, well, let's go do some history lesson here. A history lesson. You may know that the Romans occupied England for a while, from about 44 BC to about 400 AD, or I should see 400 CE, Common Era. It's a more academic abbreviation, CE, the Common Era, 400. To about the year 400, the 5th century. And at the time the Roman Empire had occupied England, but increasingly Rome was being attacked by invaders, barbarians, Huns, Goths and others on the northeastern, northern eastern fronts of the empire. Various they call them barbarian tribes, are attacking Rome. So they pull their armies out of England in order to fight battles elsewhere. So England was open, and Germanic tribes took advantage of this opportunity. So there were Germanic tribes, that is German and other related groups. They're basically tribes like the Angles and the Saxons in what is now Germany and Denmark. And there are some others like the Utes from Denmark. They came in and conquered England. England was open, it was kind of a vacuum, so these Germanic tribes came in and conquered England. And very quickly it became a separate language. So it branched off of the old German dialects that were spoken in what was back then Germany, became a different language, Anglo-Saxon or Old English. And that's what it sounded like. You may have heard the h. We used to have that in English. If you see a silent GH, like in light, the word light, L-I-G-H-T, it used to be a h. Licht, it was pronounced. Sh or h sound in Old English, but the sound later dropped out of the language, but we kept the spelling. So we have silent letters in part for that reason. What happened next? Do you know what happened in the year 1066? Do you know what happened? Famous Battle of Hastings. And what happened? Well, in northern France, what's now a province called Normandy, there were basically Old French-speaking groups called the Normans. And they conquered England. They fought the native Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and won, led by William the Conqueror. And so that was Old Norman, the Old Norman language, which was a dialect of Old French. And Old French at the time was pretty close still to Latin, from which it came. French came directly from Latin. So the French-speaking Normans conquered England and took over England. And for a while there was a divided society. The upper class spoke French, the lower class spoke basically a type of Old German, Anglo-Saxon. And what do you think happened as a result of that? Well, over time the two languages blended together, and we get different vocabulary from this time period. Have you ever wondered why we sometimes have different words for animals and meat? Well, it's from this time period when the upper class spoke French and they ate animal meat, and it was the lower class, the farmers, for example, who raised animals. They didn't get to eat them, they raised the animals so that the rich people could eat them. And so the animal names came from Anglo-Saxon, so words like cow and what else? Some words like pig, maybe, lamb, sheep, and such, especially cow. But then the rich people ate the meat and they used the old French words for the meat, like beef, pork, veal, mutton. So that's one reason we have different names for different things in English. It goes back to this divide between Anglo-Saxon and French, social divide. Over time the two languages merged together and quickly became what we call Middle English. And so by the time you get to Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, the languages had mixed together and it sounded a little bit more like French or Italian if you heard it pronounced. Over time, a lot of other changes happened in the language. The grammar got simplified, the sounds changed, the h, we lost the h sound, became a silent sound, for example, no sound. And other changes happened. We used to say, it's kind of annoying that we say you for singular and plural in English. No other language does that. We used to have separate forms. We used to say thou for you singular, or thee if it's an object of a sentence, and you and ye for plural. You subject, or ye if it's an object, plural. And it's like in French where you say tu for either singular for singular if it's informal, somebody you know informally. But you say vous for plural, but you also say vous for formal. So even in French, if I'm talking to someone formally, I would say vous. So it could be singular formal, or it's plain plural. In other European languages are like that too. Well, what happened in England was they would say thou for singular and you for plural, but then they started being formal and saying you for everybody, and the thou dropped out of the language. So then some other big sound changes happened. The vowels changed a lot. Something called the Great Vowel Shift happened over a couple of centuries in the 1500s, 1600s. The vowels changed a great deal. It's really complicated. Some other important factors, William Shakespeare kind of shaped the language some. He invented, or he at least was the first to write down and probably to invent a lot of new expressions in English. For example, phrases like cold-blooded, hot-blooded, he made those up for his plays. Another literary influence, vocabulary influence, came from the translation of the Bible into English, the King James Bible. A lot of famous idioms, expressions came from that, famous phrases in the Old Testament or Jewish the Jewish Bible, the fictional book of Daniel. There's a fictional story of God writing a message of judgment and warning on the wall, and so we have the expression in English, the writing is on the wall. We have a lot of idioms in English from that. The writing is on the wall. That means you can see there are warning signs that something bad is about to happen or that something is about to fail. There's a cool music video by OK Go called The Writing's on the Wall. We should check it out. It's a good video, good song. Then comes the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and here we have, well, I think from the time of Shakespeare and then the Renaissance, you have a transition into modern English. We've lost, we don't say thou goest, we now say you go, for example. And with the Renaissance and Enlightenment, there was an increased interest in, of course, learning. So first of all, studying Latin and Greek languages and culture, there was an increased interest in this, as well as, of course, an increased interest in new learning. Modern science began with the Enlightenment period. Modern art and modern philosophy, modern math. And so with all of these new discoveries, inventions, new ideas, we needed new words for these things. And so scholars would turn to Latin and sometimes Greek to make up new words. So a lot of academic words pretty much came into English starting from this time period. We need a new word for something, we create a new word from Latin elements, sometimes Greek elements. So that today 2/3 of English vocabulary is from Latin, especially academic vocabulary, and some is from Greek. And that has been going on ever since then. So we've had a flood of Latin words and also kind of a stream of Greek words into English since that time. Two important influences on contemporary English today. One, Spanish-speaking immigrants in the US. So when the Terminator, in the Terminator movies, Arnold Schwarzenegger says, "Hasta la vista, baby," which is goodbye in Spanish. We all know that. That's slang for us. When we say, "Oh, he's really loco," loco is Spanish for crazy. It's English slang also, American slang. We understand those words. It's slang for us. So there's a good deal of Spanish influence on English now. Then, of course, a great deal of influence from the internet, mass media, computer technology. These are the biggest influences on English right now. And so, and of course, words from modern French, a good number of words from modern French since the 1800s, 1700s, when French was once a dominant language in the world, in business and government and diplomacy. And so English has taken on a huge amount of vocabulary from Old German, Old French, Latin, modern French, Greek, Spanish, and a little bit from other languages as well. A little bit from modern German and many other languages. Along with that, spelling patterns from different languages are reflected in our language. So the spelling and pronunciation are complicated because we have these different spelling patterns. When it comes to things like word stress, we have several different stress patterns. We have Anglo-Saxon or Old English stress patterns with a lot of shorter, more common everyday words. A lot of academic words follow Latin stress patterns. From time to time, you see a Greek stress pattern like kilogram, and occasionally even a French stress pattern. Modern French words like baguette, baguette bread, baguette, stress in the last syllable. That's French style. This is why English is so complicated. It's got a very complicated history. So I say to my students, if you really want to perfect your English, all you have to do is to learn German, Latin, Greek, French, and Spanish. You learn those languages, and English will be a lot easier, right? Practical advice, right? And seriously though, it's hard, but this complex history has made English really complicated, but it also makes it really convenient for science and business, because you have this rich vocabulary you could draw from. We can make up new words whenever we need to from Latin and Greek elements. And so that's another reason, of course, the political and military dominance of the UK and the US in the 20th century. That's a big factor too, of course, but especially the rich and complex linguistic history. This has made English a very flexible language and very useful for science in many different fields. So really, if you feel like English is complicated, that's no myth. You're totally justified in thinking that. There are good reasons why you feel English is complicated, because it is. It's got a very complex history, a very complex spelling and pronunciation systems, very complex vocabulary. So yes, it is a complex language. And for that reason, especially for East Asians, it's a hard language. And by the way, for us, Korean is really hard too. Korean and Japanese are among, I think, the hardest languages I've ever tried. So it's hard for us as well. Works in reverse. So I hope you understand better about why you might be having difficulties with English. It's not just you. The language is hard. It's complicated. So that's all for now. See you later.